Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Tonight, we're pleased to host Cornelia Dayton and Henry Louis Gates Jr. to talk about new findings on the lives of John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters. AAS is pleased to be co-sponsoring this evening's program with the Worcester Black History Project. I'm also joined by AAS Director of Outreach, Kayla Hopper. For newcomers here, I want to introduce the Society briefly. AAS was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what's now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to virtual programs like this one, we also welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects or to find material on our website that might be of use to you. And I'm delighted to say we are once again welcoming readers into the reading room by appointment. Now, Kayla will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using for tonight's program. Kayla?
Thanks, Scott. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. Just a few notes about how we'll be using Zoom webinar tonight. For the open Q&A portion at the end of the program, we'll be using the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat box. You can put your questions into the Q&A function at any point during the program tonight. Due to the large number of attendees, the chat box will be used only for informational purposes. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information there, and you can contact us as presenters if there are any technical difficulties that we need to know about. If you would like to save the chat to retain the links for future use, you can save a transcription by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. Closed captioning is also available as an option for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription function. You can turn it on and off with the button labeled CC. Finally, we are recording this program and we will make it available on our website and our YouTube channel for viewing later. And that's it. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Kayla. I'm delighted now to introduce Deborah Hall, the founder and director of the Worcester Black History Project, who will tell us a bit about the project and introduce tonight's speakers. Over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everyone. Worcester Black History Project is delighted to be a co-sponsor of tonight's event. Worcester Black History Project was founded in 2018. Worcester Black History Project recognizes and celebrates the experiences of Black people in Worcester and the surrounding areas by encouraging the preservation and dissemination of this history through scholarly educational outreach and programming. Worcester Black History Project works with other local organizations and community stakeholders to advance its work in three key areas: collection and preservation of local Black history, development and coordination of Black history programs and exhibits, and creation of an accessible historical archive for students, educators, and community members. And now I would like to introduce to you this evening's guests. Cornelia H. Dayton is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. Her prize-winning books include Women Before the Bar, Gender, Law, and Society in Connecticut, 1639 to 1789, and Robert Love's Warnings, Searching for Strangers in Colonial Boston, co-authored with Sharon V. Salinger. Dr. Dayton was elected to AAS membership in 2000. And Henry Louis Gates Jr. is the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He has authored or co-authored many books and documentary films, and he is the host of Finding Your Roots, a groundbreaking genealogy series on PBS. Dr. Gates was elected to AAS membership in 1989. Before our guests engage in conversation, Dr. Dayton will say a few words about her article, Lost Years Recovered, John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters in Middleton, which received the 2020 Whitehall Prize and appeared in September of 2021 in the New England Quarterly. Dr. Dayton.
Thank you, Deborah, and thanks to the AAS for bringing us together tonight for a good conversation. not everyone has had a chance to read this article with new findings, so I just summarize it a bit. My article describes some of the things that Phillis Wheatley Peters and her husband, John Peters, experienced in the 3 years when they left Boston. And people have wondered, researching them, where they went. And the answer lies in these legal papers I came across, that they went to the interior Essex County town of Middleton, a kind of impoverished town that was carved out of Salem Village. And it's a harrowing story, what happened to them there. They started those years, which were 1780 to 1783, hopeful that John's new ownership of a 110-acre farm deeded to him by a former enslaver would secure their livelihood and afford a healthy environment for them to raise a family and for Phillis to live an intellectual's life as a poet and author. She suffered from a serious asthmatic condition, and it was thought in that period that country air would be very helpful. So at first, when they moved to Middleton, the Peterses lived in a blended household with 2 other people, widow Naomi Wilkins, a white householder, John's former enslaver, and Dinah Cubber, a Black woman who was a longtime servant, probably earlier enslaved, to the Wilkinses. Widow Wilkins had invited John Peters to move into her household with his family, but after a few months of living, the 4 of them together, they had a rupture in their relationship. And Wilkins, the widow, and Cubber moved out. So suits and countersuits ensued, and eventually John Peters, who was already an experienced litigant, lost most of the suits. Most importantly, Widow Wilkins won an ejectment suit against him, by which John and Phillis were forced to leave the farmstead in September of 1783. Why did John Peters lose the land? It was because he had signed a mortgage deed conveying those acres back to the widow if he failed in his promise to support her for the rest of her life. And of course, once their relationship ruptured, she refused any provisions that he offered her, and hence he could not fulfill his promise. So that's a long enough summary for now. We'll just say that the 120 legal papers I found, which were generated by several suits, contain many more details. And as with all written records, they leave us with many unanswered questions.
Great. Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be joining you this evening, and very, very exciting for me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with Professor Cornelia Dayton about her truly remarkable recovery of Phillis Wheatley's lost years, essentially restoring key details about 10% of the poet's life and an even larger percentage of her life after she arrived in Boston from the Windward Coast, originating, according to the guru of the transatlantic slave trade, David Eltis, and I quote, somewhere in what is today Sierra Leone or Liberia, not in Senegambia. And Sierra Leone or Liberia is the source of only about 5.6% of our African ancestors overall in the transatlantic slave trade to North America. To have found even one detail about Wheatley and Peters' lives, Nina, would have been quite an achievement. But filling in these heretofore lost 3 years is an astonishing accomplishment, one I admire very much, and one all scholars of African American and American literature and all scholars of the Enlightenment should applaud, and applaud heartily. So, Professor, my hat's off to you. To summarize, before your discoveries, we knew through the fine work of Vincent Coretta and other biographers details about Wheatley's life up to April 1780 and from January 1784 until her death in December of that year, as well as details about John Peters' life after Phillis Wheatley Peters' death. Now, Nina, because of your work, we know where Peters and Wheatley were living and why they were living there during the heretofore so-called lost years, and that they had definitely at least one child and probably more. Although Wheatley is barely mentioned directly in the Middleton dossier, as you call it, you found a great deal of information about John Peters' post-Middleton life. And as my friend Vincent Coretta put it to me, and I quote, and what's now known about his person, actions, and character during those lost years, albeit usually from hostile testimonies, perhaps allows us to infer some things about Phillis Wheatley herself, such as why she chose to marry John Peters and her sense of social status in Middleton, and the fact that, Vin's quote continues, she apparently devoted her attention to her marriage family rather than to publishing any new poems while living in Middleton, unquote. So let me start by asking you about the implications of your work vis-a-vis one of her earliest biographers. One of Phillis Wheatley's earliest biographers, of course, was Margaretta Matilda Odell. We've all read that book, whose book, Memoir and Poems of Phillis Wheatley, published in 1834. Nearly 200 years later, we can all agree that it's, shall we say politely, unreliable overall. But I'm curious, based on your own research, how close does Odell come at times to getting things right? For example, the existence of at least one child. And how about Odell's characterization of John Peters?
Right. This is a big question, and I should just say for the audience that this happens with other figures too, of course. But if you go online or you look up some encyclopedias, biographical encyclopedias, you'll find that some of the details of Phillis Wheatley's life come from Margaretta Odell's memoir, and other biographers since have found many of those details to be inaccurate, or at least undocumented. So you have to be careful. You have to go to Vincent Coretta's biography and not to some of the older biographies. I think people were, very keen to find out details, to know details of Wheatley's life. It was hard to resist Odell's descriptions, which she said came from sort of family oral history or memories. I'm really at the stage, Skip, of not trusting anything she says, but that's because there's so many things she states that we found out to be inaccurate, right? She said that the couple went from Boston to Wilmington, Mass., and that's not the case. It's Middleton. And I mean, worst of all, I think she portrayed the man Phillis married as a cad, as an uppity black man, as you and I have discussed, as really close to neglectful. And from what these new findings reveal, that's really not borne out. Now, on the question of children, I guess I would just say that Phillis Wheatley Peters was in her 20s, and we would expect her to have pregnancies and to have children. And there's some indication that first summer that they lived in Middleton, she hired a young woman as a nurse for a month. That's sometimes an indication that a woman has had given birth. And if the child didn't survive, sadly, you still needed a nurse often. So, there could have been more than one child, but we really don't know. And I don't particularly want to go with Odell's lore about that.
Well, you quote one source when Peters says, "I'm bringing my family." And then you talk about the nurse. So that would suggest, you imply that there could be at least two, that one is implied in the first statement when he says family, and the hiring the nurse implies the second one. And that would be perfectly reasonable. I found that fascinating. But you know what? The thing I found most fascinating about your essay, Nina, you were fascinated with John Peters. I admired that. I was caught up all of a sudden thinking about John Peters in a way I hadn't thought about him much at all. There's Greg Waz. He says disparaging things about Peters in 1808. Odell does. The brother has a bad rap. And all of a sudden, I felt that I was in the hands of his potential biographer. So I want to ask you two questions. One, Tell us what you think about John Peter. Who, what, where, when, and why. And secondly, Nina, would you ever consider trying to write a biography of the infamous John Peters? And
right,
for those of you who don't know, Professor Dayton's family name is Nina.
Yeah.
Or
nickname, right.
nickname.
So those are great questions. I mean, I think Peters is something still of a mystery, as many people in the past are. They're complicated personalities from the clues that we have. But an important issue is, do we have some insight into why Phillis Wheatley chose to marry him? And the poet and scholar Honore Jeffers, I think, eloquently tackled this in an essay at the back of her wonderful book of poems, The Age of Phillis. She felt that scholars really needed to do more to take the marriage seriously. And of course, there had been great attention by literary scholars in the Phillis Wheatley, who was the author of the book of poems in 1773 and before her marriage. And because we didn't know much about what happened to them during the marriage, it was sort of easy to forget John Peters. But now we know more. And one thing I would say is that he clearly was a person of dignity and stature who insisted on being treated with dignity and respect. And he had lots of economic relationships with white settler people, as we would expect, as a free Black man, and he defended his interests in court. He was able to get as lawyers some of the most prominent lawyers of Salem and Newburyport and Boston. And I think we have to trust Phillis in a way, right? That he was an attractive, charismatic, ambitious person. One of the issues we have with the Middleton legal papers is that we again have some unreliable narrators, and that the people who gave depositions, by the time they gave them, they were his enemies. And so they portray him in negative lights as someone who had a temper, who raged against Dinah Cubber, the other Black woman in the household. But I suspect that on that particular occasion, for instance, he raged against her because something triggered it. Maybe Dinah Cubber threatened his wife or threatened his infant child. We don't have his account or Phillis Wheatley Peters' account. So we have to tread carefully. I think there is more research to be done on John Peters and his three brothers. We now know he has three brothers who lived in Essex County with the last name Francis. So I hope the genealogists are kind of going actively on this. Yes, I would consider writing a short biography of
I happen to have
John
a contract right here for.
I mean, I would want to make sure that Vin Coretta didn't want to do it first. I felt for a long time that there's, and as with many, many other people, and Worcester Black history is a good indication of this, that we all know that there is great work to be done on African Americans and their lives in the 18th century, in the early 19th century in New England. And New Englanders were so good at keeping records that people are surprised at how much people can be traced. Mm-hmm. So that would be part of my interest.
Well, you've shown that in extraordinary detail, my friend. On page 318, you mentioned several ways through which John Peters could possibly have gained his freedom. Had he been manumitted, had he purchased his freedom through hard work, and I'm quoting you here, or had he walked away from his unidentified enslaver? You present those three options. Which do you think it is? Which do you think is most likely, and why?
I guess I would choose the third one. What that quote points to is that that first of all, there's a gap in the Peters history in that we're told in the depositions that his brother gives, for instance, that he was enslaved in the Wilkins family as a child and a youth. And then he was sold by that family. And we don't know to whom or in what circumstances, but that would have been about the mid 1760s. And then his brother tells us he reappeared, John Peters did, in Boston in 1776 and obtained his freedom, but doesn't say how. It doesn't say how. But the question is interesting one, because this is just the time in Massachusetts when enslaved people are leaving their enslavement, I think often by what we might say is walking out. And by 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution passes with a Bill of Rights that suggests all people have equal rights. And by 1783, there's some definitive freedom suits or rulings that say slavery is not permissible really anymore. But scholars like Gloria Whiting have shown that really the numbers of people formerly enslaved have precipitously declined by 1780. So he was part of that. And I could see him negotiating with an enslaver. He's a strong man, according to the physical descriptions we have. And Black men like that, like Venture Smith in Connecticut, who wrote a really interesting autobiography that many people teach and read, bargained, negotiated with their enslaver to work extra hours, etc., and to buy their freedom. So that could be Peters. Or, I think in Massachusetts, people are walking to Boston and their enslavers are reading the tea leaves and not pursuing them as property.
Yeah, I would agree. I find that fascinating. Phillis Wheatley, quote unquote, is never mentioned by name in the Middleton dossier. But as you note in your splendid essay, Massachusetts Council President Jeremiah Powell wrote in a letter to Thomas Durfee on November 19th, 1778, that John Peters, or Peter, quote, lately married the famous poetess, a Negro girl, sometimes past servant to the late Mr. Wheatley of Boston. This is in your footnote 27. And by the way, this was in connection to an order by the Massachusetts Council to apprehend Peters on suspicion that he may have been helping the British during the Revolutionary War, which really took me out, right? But so I'd love your thoughts about that. Was John Peters a would-be loyalist and about to end up with Phillis in Nova Scotia and in Sierra Leone, where, according to David Eltis, she started in the first place, or either Liberia? That would have been quite ironic.
Right.
But my question is about the discrepancy, and you know what's coming. How might the discrepancy between the date of Phillis Wheatley's and John Peters' marriage on November 26, 1778, and the earlier date of Powell's letter on November 19th be explained?
I don't have an explanation. I just think he was in error, perhaps, because when I started, well, a few months ago, Peter Drummy, the librarian of the MHS, checked the marriage record for me because they have the ledgers of that church where they married. Because I thought, was there a mistake made in that? And it's absolutely clear, November 26th. So my guess is that Powell knew they were about to be married, and it was like a slip of the pen. But other people may have other readings of it. What's intriguing, there are many intriguing things about that document, which one is, was he engaged in what we might call petty treason as a trader on the make, trying to make money, supplying the British Army with coffee and goods from his small grocery store in Boston? Many people made money that way during war, right? On the other hand, there's things about the document that are odd. They expect him to be moving from a town in Worcester, where he was, to a town in Bristol County near Rhode Island, and he never shows up there, and they never arrest him. So to me, that suggests he was suspected, and that's fascinating. Who informs on him, who suspects him, and why, but that there was no valid evidence. And the only other thing we know is that a year or so later, he is in the same Worcester County town where they knew he was going on that occasion to trade with a white partner and to sell goods. So I think he has an established connection to that town, and it might not have had anything to do with abetting the British.
Okay, thanks. In footnote 22, I was particularly intrigued. You write that a series of depositions recorded in 1779, 1780 referred to the legatee in John Wilkins' will, quote, as John Peters, even if at the time of the incidents being recalled, the deponents had known him as Peter Frizer, Frizer, or another name. And then you write, and I'm quoting again, possibly the man who became John Peters was John Francis, unquote. That adds still another name to the mix. Can you explain this to us, these name shifts? And he was a very protean character, and say more about the likelihood that this John Francis was John Peters. And who is Mr. Frizer? What's going on here?
Well, I think the short story is that, as far as we know, the man who became John Peters, known as John Peters, used two aliases at least before he kind of settled on John Peters, which was about 1778, 79, when he married Phillis Wheatley. And it's puzzling. And we know he would be called Peter Francis. I might have misstated it in the article as John Francis, because his brother later deposed that before he became John Peters, he was called here in Middleton, he was called John Francis.
That was Snow Francis,
yes,
right?
Yes, yeah. His brother, who was called Snow. And you have a good reading of why he might have been called Snow. Skip, could you just say that?
Yeah, there's a long history of actually racist and ironic naming practices, where a dark person of African descent was given a name like Snow or Snowball. Right. And I have a feeling, I think it's reasonable to guess
in that tradition.
That it's in that tradition, yeah.
Yes, right. Anyway, so I'm wondering if perhaps John Peters called himself John Peters living in Boston in the years in which he met Phillis and then married her. But when he went to Middleton, where he was reestablishing a relationship with his former enslavers, the Wilkinses, he called himself Peter Frizer, because that's what they said. And they also said, when John Wilkins wrote a will and left us a modest, small bequest to Phillis's husband, he called him Peter Frizer. And so, was this part of some sort of duplicity on John Peters' part? It doesn't quite make sense. I'm not sure. Was he just trying to figure out what name he'd like to use, and he was trying different ones? Also, Frizer as a last name, Frizer, there's nothing like it in all of Essex County. There are no white people with that name. Frizzell is the closest, but that's not the same thing. People have pointed out that in German and in French, the word means hairdresser or barber. And that was not uncommon profession for Black men in the African diaspora in North America. But there are lots of mysteries here, Skip, I'm afraid. Why is he using aliases? Why does he settle on John Peters? We could have a whole nother conversation about that.
And naming and renaming is part of, Booker T. Washington famously said that two things all the enslaved people did after the Civil War was walk off the plantation if the only thing they did was turn around and walk back, and do something with their names, even give themselves a middle name, an entitlement, because that was part of their entitlements. So But we're finding a lot more in the genealogical research that we do in finding your roots. Very often, I mean, overwhelmingly, people kept the names that they were calling themselves, the surnames that they were using in the slave quarters, rather than reinventing their names completely. But some people did, like Freeman is an obvious name.
Right.
But often those names are quite consistent, and surprisingly, they are the surnames of the people who most recently own them, which is something to ponder, and something that's counterintuitive. Let me add that it's very important for us to remember that Phillis Wheatley accomplished all that she did before the publication of her book in September 1773, essentially as a Black teenage enslaved female. I'm going to repeat that. She was a teenager. We guessed that she was 20 when her book was published in September 1773. And she was in a massively uneven power relationship with the people who were ostensibly her quote unquote friends and who for various reasons encouraged her career. That cannot be overstated. That fact of that and you used the word subaltern in your piece once. And I was pleased that you did, because there's a lot of romanticization among scholars about this warm and cozy, fuzzy relationship that she ostensibly had with her circle of white people in Boston. And I'm not buying it. I think that fails to account for the unevenness of the subaltern relationship to which she was subjected, and which you, in so much brilliant detail, show how it played out, the ramifications of that subaltern status in their life in Middleton between 1780 and 1783. I mean, think about this. In 1761, she was one of 7,161 enslaved Africans who arrived in North America along with her, bringing the total of Black people who had arrived directly from Africa in what became the United States, 221,229. In the year that she published her book of poems, 10,141 enslaved Africans arrived in North America, bringing that total to 271,940. And when she died in 1784, 4,980 enslaved Africans arrived in the United States, bringing that total to 288,000. And between that date and 1808, another 100,000 Africans would be brought directly from Africa in the slave trade. This was Phillis Wheatley's nation, as she called other Black people in her relationship to them in a letter that she wrote to Arbor Tanner. And I'm interested in the complexity of the class relations within that so-called nation. And so here, you know where this is leading. Tell me elaborate on for our friends who join us. And for a while, I keep forgetting we have an audience. You know, I'm enjoying this conversation with you so much. Talk about John Peters' relationship with Dinah Cubber and the implications for class distinctions within the race, as we would call it. By the way, Nina, family name is what our people in our tradition call a nickname.
All right.
Okay.
Got it.
All right. Anyway, tell me about Dinah and John. You know, they hated each other. What was going on there?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that emerges in this Middleton dossier is really sort of violent relationship and tension between John Peters and Dinah Cubber. And it's hard for us to parse that. But one clue we have about Dinah Cubber's reasonable unhappiness about how the household changed when John Peters arrived with his wife and perhaps an infant, is that my understanding is that he and Dinah Cubber had been enslaved in the household as younger people. So they knew each other. We don't know what relationship they had at that point. Now he reappears and he's the landowner. He owns the land, and he begins to exercise his muscles as the male head of household, governing, setting the rules as all the prescriptive literature of the time would tell a male head of household should do. And one of the things he says is evidently is that his wife will not be a cook in this household, which left Dinah Cubber and the widow Naomi Wilkins, the white woman, to be the cooks. And basically we can infer to do the domestic chores that women did, and it was heavy physical labor. I read this as John Peters protecting his wife from those difficult chores and very time-consuming chores by which women ran households. Whether he might be protecting her in the summer of 1780 because she was pregnant and perhaps ill or having a difficult pregnancy. And he might have been protecting her because of class differences among African Americans and, of course, whites too. In that, she was she had been to London and met very influential figures in the Enlightenment. She had an education that most people in Middleton, white or black, didn't have, in letters. She was a writer. She was a very quick study of, she could write a poem or an elegy or an ode, evidently in a short period of time, responding emotionally to someone's pain or death in their family. So she has a kind of world experience that the other two women in the household don't have. And that caused tensions, especially if John Peters was protecting her from doing the normal work that women did in a household.
So class trump race.
In this case, yes,
Yeah.
and within the household, and caused tensions. I mean, one way of thinking of it is that Phillis didn't intentionally introduce tensions into the household, but by who she was and by her relationship with her husband, that meant that the two other women were resentful and probably felt that hierarchies were being subverted in ways that they were not comfortable with.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Nina, what were the circumstances of the Peters upon their return to Boston? What happened to all those so-called, friends that she had? I've always been dubious about that. But all those white former allies of the poet, where were they? Did they ignore her? What were the nature of the couple's lodgings in the West End? And when and why did they move from their lodgings near Charlestown Ferry, where they were in July? So there's three questions there, really.
Well, yes, you put friends in quotes, and I think for good reason. I think there are two periods, not just the time when they returned to Boston, unfortunately, the 12-month period before Phillis's death in 1784, but also the time after she was manumitted by her enslaver, John Wheatley, to the time of her marriage. We don't really have a sense that her white allies were part of her life, right? So in those two periods, it's a question mark, and there's an absence. And she was evidently living very modestly.
So
and
when you say two periods, you mean after Susanna dies?
Right.
Right. What happened to her after? And she's not left anything in the will. Right. And then the second time, right. Okay.
Yeah. So these questions are good ones. And Tara Bynum made a wonderful suggestion in a conversation we had a month ago that we probably need to comb through more of the surviving letters, family correspondence, et cetera, of elite white families, these well-connected, well-educated, well-read people, for clues to the lives of the African Americans who they were involved with and had economic relationships with, et cetera. And maybe there are clues there. But I really don't know, Skip, more than the few records that we have, what happened in their last year when they had to leave Middleton, where John Peters was quite in a a lot of debt because, as many men were at this time, because he had lost most of his suits and he owed money. And we know that after Phillis's death and just before it, he was in and out of debtor's prison in Boston. Presumably they had modest lodgings. Many people who lived in Boston rented, so it's not unusual that they were renting. I would just note that when a person dies, as Phillis did in December of 1784, and the newspaper runs a short obituary, they announced from where the funeral procession would start. And in that case, it was their lodgings opposite the family mansion of the Bowden family. But we don't know from whom they were renting or how had they descended into poverty, which Margaretta Odell suggested. I think John Peters was trying his best to keep them afloat, and I don't quite buy the abject poverty picture either, even though I agree with you that we don't see evidence that white patronesses were there on the scene socializing with the Peterses.
Thank you. I want to go back to the beginning, really, which is the prelude to the beginning. I asked you to do the summary, which you did at the top, because as you know, most people or many people will not have read your fine essay with all those detailed footnotes, right? But how did you find this? You know, I tell my graduate students, we don't need one more post-structural reading of Their Eyes Were Watching God, as much as I love Their Eyes Were Watching God, right? We need, there are treasures in the archive. And it's particularly true for the African-American church. You can make your career, you can be famous just by delving deeply into the archives. I tell my graduate students at Harvard in the English department, in American Studies, and in African-American Studies this every week. There's gold in them there hills, and you have proven that. So I want you to tell us the most obvious question. I want you to answer the most obvious question of all, which you're minding your business, walking down the street, and a big trove of documents falls out of the sky, and you go, "Oh my God, where's Vin Coretta? Too bad, Vin. I have found Phillis." How in the world did you solve the mystery that has haunted Wheatley scholars for 200 years, really?
Well, it's a mundane answer, and it's what historians love to say. As a friend of mine wrote in his legal history blog, she was just minding her own business as a legal historian, looking for other things. That's right. What happens, right? I was looking for evidence about how New Englanders understood and responded to people's mental health challenges in the long 18th century. That's a big book that I'm working on. And one of the best types of evidence for that are contested will cases. So I was reading a big volume in the state archives called the Supreme Court of Probates, which is really just the governor and council sitting in and deciding on appealed probate cases, meaning people's wills, the administration of estates. And contested will cases often revolve around the mental capacity of the testator. So if an heir wants to say, Uncle John his mind was wandering when he wrote that will and cut me out of it, so I wanted to declare it invalid. What's interesting for me about those contested will cases is they tend to generate a lot of depositions, and the neighbors say, well, we did think his mind was wandering and this is why, or we don't. We think he was as sane as he ever was. But you get this vernacular testimony that is very interesting. So John Wilkins's will in Middleton was one of those cases, but it turned out that the mental capacity issue was a red herring. But of course, the interesting thing was that the person appealing initially and then a second time was John Peters. Once I knew who John Peters was, Phillis Wheatley's husband, I realized that there was new information here, and it just took a while to untangle a very complicated nest of litigation.
How long is a while, Professor?
Several years.
Wow, that's great. That's the essay. Hey, Scott. Scott's like Dr. Death showing up saying, okay.
We've got a lot of questions here from listeners. So
well, we're not finished yet. They can get to in 1 minute. Nina, I hope that you will, that's the essay I want you to write. I mean, I'm sure others have suggested it, but I think it will be so good for our students and so good for people in our various fields if you talk about how you did this. If you make explicit the backstory, the bones, the exos, put the skeleton outside the body. I think that would be very, very important and very, very useful and fascinating too. So I hope that you do that.
So could I just say, you mean I kind of process? How did I find the materials? How did I do the research?
No. Okay. Yeah, and people can use it as a guide. And I think it will inspire as much as knowing how you did this will be very useful to teachers of graduate students. And we can, encourage them. It's not that they can mimic your every step, but they can see how one scholar opened the archive and found something that had been lost for a long, long time, right there, it was staring at you, right? And we couldn't see it. So, and the way that in that animated way that you just answered, I hope that you use that voice and write an essay about this. And if anybody from the New York Times is listening, I hope you publish it. All right.
But let's just add, Skip, that, there are researchers out there, some of whom I know, who are doing extraordinary work in trolling through the court records, which are, my particular bailiwick, and I think can be very revealing about ordinary people's lives and African-American people's lives. But, and because we need these longitudinal studies of how many Black litigants were there and what were their patterns of winning cases, what were their strategies. And how did that change over the course of the colonial period and the early national period? So I would see that as part of this, quest.
Oh, good. And I hope you write about that. I mean, that would be another very important reason to do that. Scott, my brother.
Yes, sir. We have a lot of questions. Actually, you just answered one that has come up multiple times, which is, how did you find this? And tell us about the cache of legal papers. So that's been answered. Several people ask about what the legal papers reveal, if anything, about what Phillis Wheatley Peters might have been doing during this time. Sounds as though the legal papers don't reveal a lot about her, but maybe if they do reveal anything, this would be a good chance to give a sense of that. One person asked, is there a sense that she was writing or working at another job? Another person has asked about whether she might have been dropped by her white friends when she got married, and so on. So lots of different questions arising from, what's she doing during these lost years?
We don't know much. My guess is that she was pregnant 2 or 3 times and may have suffered miscarriages or stillbirths. And, I just heard you say, Skip, that Vincoretta has a reading that she wasn't writing in this time period. I'm not sure about that. But the mystery for us is we have no letters from her, and she'd been quite a correspondent. So what happened to those letters? And I was wondering if, because her name changed, she now signed herself Phillis Peters, right? Not Phillis Wheatley, the author's name. Might they not have been preserved because people didn't realize that this was the literary figure?
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, it's quite possible. Yeah.
So, my guess is there are lost letters, Scott, and lost poems too. And of course, one huge issue in Wheatley scholarship is that we know there was a second volume of manuscript, meaning handwritten volume of poems, some of which were written before Phillis's marriage, that the couple tried to get published in Boston and didn't have any takers. And then there's a 1791 letter in the Isaiah Thomas papers at the AS suggesting that John Peters had recovered this manuscript volume, having lost it and advertised in the newspapers for it to be returned to him, but it was never published. So what happened to it? Where is it? Is one big issue.
You know, when Vin Coretta told me that he said he was sworn to secrecy, he couldn't tell me, but there was a major announcement about Wheatley scholarship happening on Friday. This is Monday. So I go, Vin, what is going to drive me crazy? I go, okay, it's got to be either someone has found her gravestone, which hasn't been found, or someone has found the lost manuscript. And he said, no, it's not. But, you know, I'm telling everybody out there, that manuscript's out there. That, I like somebody just said, missing is not lost. Missing is not lost. That missing manuscript, if that's better. Cornelia, where is it?
I'm not sure, but I do think that Salem is one place to look, both in the papers of the Phillips Library, Salem families who lived in, whose papers are there, and also booksellers and their records, because a number of the books that Phillis Wheatley acquired on her trip to London so from booksellers as gifts, a copy of Paradise Lost, and all the works of Alexander Pope, Joe Resnick and others have shown where those are in the Library Company, at Houghton at Harvard. And I'm very intrigued that that copy of Paradise Lost was given to Houghton by the very wealthy China trader Dudley Pickman of Salem in 1824. So my question is, how did he get it? And I think two of his children had other books she owned. So how did that happen? And could that be a clue to the missing manuscript?
All right, I'm driving up there tomorrow. Scott.
Well, we've got a number of questions, and I think this leads into some of them about the relationships between the Peterses and the various white people in this story. And so we have a question. Says, wonderful conversation, Skip and Nina. I think Nina's findings finally overturn Odell's characterization of John Peters and the nature of Phillis and John's marriage, something a lot of us have questioned for some time. I was wondering if you would speculate on the need of the family that enslaved Phillis to denigrate their marriage and Phillis's family life in order to spotlight their own benevolence and attempt to share in Phillis's celebrity.
Well, I think this is a reference to Margaretta Odell, right, being a grandniece or something. I always get it quite slightly wrong, but of the Wheatleys. And I think Margaret Minardi has written very interestingly about this in her book, Making Slavery. And another piece that people might want to look at, I'm forgetting, it's in the footnotes of my article, but is it Glatt? The author's last name is Glatt, and it's about Margaretta Odell and her life, and she ends up being institutionalized perhaps for mental illness and living for a long time in an asylum under a guardianship. So she has a complicated life. I don't think it absolves her of this romanticized in some ways and distorted picture of Phillis Wheatley Peters and John Peters. But to me, the question is really about why would the Wheatleys want to make themselves look good? I think we can understand why. It's part of, as Joanne Pope Mellish and others have written, the erasure by white elites of slavery and the harshness of racial slavery and the denial of human rights under slavery in the North. No, but the Wilkins family of Middleton, if we go back to Middleton, we don't know what they wrote about. We don't have memoirs or family lore. That is a kind of fascinating question. What stories did they tell? This particular Wilkins family didn't have surviving children, which is why they invited John Peters to come and take care of the land. They did not have a son. For instance, he in essence becomes a substitute son in their wishes initially.
And we have a specific question about that. In fact, would it have been common for widows to seek human continuing care by enjoining servants or young relatives in the way that Widow Wilkins did?
That's a great question.
Yeah, well, as Dirk Hartog and others have said to me, this is partly a history of caretaking. What arrangements do people make? One question would be, why would the widow agree to this arrangement? Why would she deed that much of the land while she was still alive and not save it as a kind of carrot, saying, when I die, you can inherit? And I think the best clue we have is the way she put it in her deposition, which is basically, she indicates John Peters would not come and move into my household as I wanted him to, unless I did this. So we get a sense of his animating, driving force and genius, we might say, in arranging this. But on the other hand, he got himself in a bind, right? He couldn't have anticipated that. But some of my legal historian friends have said, this is a really creative mortgage. Were there any more like this? We'd have to read through all the deeds of Essex County, and they're not searchable by word, even if they're digitized. But a deed which says, I will give back to you the 110 acres that you just deeded to me in a separate deed, unless I fail to support you comfortably. And it's really laid out, in illness and health delicacies, it's very detailed. It's a very interesting caretaking arrangement. I haven't really answered the question, is how often was it a former employee, servant, non-kin, enslaved person who took on that role? Doesn't seem very usual. What do you think?
So if you could go back and give your client a bit of legal advice before he signed this agreement, what would you tell him? What was his mistake?
That's a great question. Because the problem with not making that promise is he probably wouldn't get deeded the 110 acres. And he'd have to wait and rely on the widow's promise, right, that it would come to him. And we can see that most of the heirs actually lived in Amherst, New Hampshire, and that's some distance. And they're somewhat offended that the property didn't come their way. So you'd think that there would have been pressure for her, even if she made that promise, right, to not deliver, perhaps in her own will. So I'm not sure. It seems to me he drove a pretty interesting and good bargain, but things fell apart. And also I think, there's a structural racism is playing an important role here, and why he doesn't succeed in Middleton. Because as a Black man, he by custom, he is not called to serve on juries. He is not given even the smallest of town offices. And it's by town office holding that you really show that you can be valuable to your community. He doesn't have that possibility.
I hate to say this, but our hour is fast drawing to a close here. And then I'm sorry because we have other questions, but we are running out of time. And so I would
Nina and I are going to stay here another hour. Sorry.
Well, I don't know
hungry now.
if you want company. We've got people out there who would certainly keep you company. I would like to thank both of you, Nina Dayton and Henry Louis Gates, for this stimulating conversation, and thank all of you who've been watching. We have more than 200 people watching tonight, and I'm very grateful for that. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are available on the AAS YouTube channel. We encourage you to check out our upcoming programs, which are listed on the American Antiquarian Society website, including next Wednesday afternoon at 4, Aston Gonzalez talking about his book, Visualizing Equality, African American Rights and Visual Culture in the 19th Century. And then the week after that, on November 17th at 7 p.m., historians William Hart and David Silverman will be discussing Professor Hart's new book, For the Good of Their Souls, Performing Christianity in 18th Century Mohawk Country. And we've got more after Thanksgiving as well. To learn more about upcoming events and access information about Worcester's Black history, please visit the Worcester Black History Project website, which is worcesterblackhistoryproject.org. And with that, I want to thank Skip Gates and Nina Dayton once more, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Nina. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And congratulations, Nina. I admire you so much. Bravo. Bravo.
We'll keep talking.
Bye-bye. Good night, everyone.
Good night.